My name is Kerrie O'Leary and I am a computational artist based between Dublin and London. And yeah, this talk is kind of going to be about, well, currents and code, but kind of like a journey from where I've come from and like my practice to date, the different projects that I've worked on, my inspiration for them, and kind of how I've executed them. So if you have any questions, like as I'm talking about either project or anything, feel free to ask, or else there'll be questions at the end, and there'll be kind of like beers and more of the matcha drinks afterwards if people want to kind of look more at the show, because we're taking it down on Saturday, so please enjoy the rest of the work. But yeah, thanks so much. So a few things before I start talking about all the different projects that I might use this type of terminology throughout it. Don't worry, it's not going to be really tech heavy, but just some things that like people actually stop and ask me what they mean. So like people ask me, what is a computational artist, or like what does that mean? So it's not like really techy or anything. It just means that like using computers and maths in the work that I do, and that's kind of like the heart of most of my projects. So I just thought I'd disclose that at the beginning. And then another one actually that I like very embarrassingly only like really understood like a few years ago is algorithm. And that again simply is just a set of rules or steps. It's a nice fancy word basically, but you can even think of considering how you make your cup of tea or your cup of coffee as an algorithm, and some people do them differently. Some people put the milk in before their tea bag or that type of stuff, and there's different ways of writing algorithms or setting them out. Some of them are more efficient, and then some of them might be less efficient but more like less costly in terms of energy and stuff like that. So there's different ways that people approach algorithms. And then open source, oh, that's a nice typo. Open source data is kind of just information that's made publicly available and carries no restrictions on their use or who uses them or how they're used. So if anybody else like has another question, can't be too technical because I probably wouldn't be able to answer it on the spot. But I think one of the really important things about my work is it's really inspired where I grew up and where I go back home. Howth is a peninsula just about 30 minutes outside of Dublin City. So I grew up sailing, swimming and paddleboarding. So just being always beside the water, like going for like walks and hikes, and always having like just like the sea and the ocean and the tides present like as a young child, I think. And as I grew up, that really influenced my projects to date. So I have an undergrad in management science and information systems. So it's kind of like problem solving, data analytics, and more like engineering maths. And I really actually hated it. I couldn't understand how like to code properly. Like I didn't actually have a clue what algorithms meant back then. And I think it was like really how it was being taught, that there was no creative end to the tasks or the assignments that we had. It was all very much like, oh, create a database for X and that's going to be used in this type of industry. So it took me 5 years to get through that, and then I moved to New York City because a lot of the other peers that I was studying with were going to work for like the big four, going to consulting, and I was like, that is not for me. So I moved to New York and I'm working in an art gallery over there. I've always been really creative, and I was like, oh, this might be like a nice way for me to get into that industry. My visa ran out, so I moved back to Dublin and worked for a company there for a few years in a completely unrelated job. And then the pandemic hit, and I think, I don't know about a lot of people in this room here, but I think a good few people like had that kind of like eureka moment or like realization of, wow, what do I really want to do with my life? So I decided that I really wanted to pursue my creative passions, and I started looking at different courses or ways that I could go about that, and I found an MFA in computational art at Goldsmiths University. So I moved to London, and that's kind of when my life started to change about 4.5 years ago. So the first project that I worked on in the master's was seasick. So I'd moved to London, it was a pandemic, and I'd always grown up or lived beside the sea, or in New York I was close to the rivers. So I always kind of had that like moving water close by, and like there's something like that you feel differently when you're close to the water. So I decided that my first assignment would be a way of using data, real data, to try and evoke an emotion that people could even like feel that they were close to the sea without being physically there. So instead of being homesick, I was seasick. So this installation visualised a data set of Irish wave heights from the west coast of Ireland, suspending dozens of fabric from a series of motors. So this is kind of like the thought process behind it. I wanted the inputs to be the wave height, so the data, and then the output would be a moving piece, and in this case it was fabric. I also used micro servos, which are these like small computer elements, and they have like a range of 180, so there's like an arm out of the motor, and it only rotates 180 degrees. And so that meant that I needed to figure out a way of, okay, well, if a wave height is 2 meters or a big one is 10 meters, like how am I going to visualize the difference between those waves with this range of motion? So I should go back to where I kind of started looking for the data. And around Ireland, like this kind of exists all over the world, but there's different weather stations. And I kind of wanted it to be more so, even though I'm from the East Coast, I wanted the waves are just more interesting over in the West Coast of Ireland. So there's more like a diverse range between like the small and the large ones, and there's just more activity. So I decided that I'd focus on that. And that's kind of what the weather stations look like. And then this is like open source data. So you can go on, you can decide what weather stations you want to use, the date range, and the different variables that you want to use. So for this one, I just decided to stick with the wave heights. But because it was the pandemic, I had to go back to Dublin for Christmas. So this was the first semester of the Masters. And I realized that I had like set about this big project that I wanted to do. And I had done all the proposals and like the pitching to the lecturers. This was going to be what I was going to execute. And then it was that stage in Dublin where you had to isolate for 10 days when you landed. So I had to do it all in my childhood bedroom. So I had already said that I was going to use 36 motors, which I had never used one motor in a project before, so that was definitely an endeavour. My poor brother, who is an actual engineer, was like on the other side of the door trying to tell me how to do things if I was like stuck. This is kind of how I was laying out the different fabrics. And then this is how like I was prototyping with like literally kitchen paper under a desk. And then the way I was going to troubleshoot it was I used different colour wires for the different currents going through the different beams. So that way, at least if one of them wasn't working, I wouldn't have to look at like 36 wires to figure out which one wasn't behaving. So this, thankfully, I was able to then, for the second semester, everything was put online, so I was able to get a residency in the village of Howth down the road from me, so I could actually install this in like somewhere that people could actually see. So this is the video of the different, there we go, sorry. So you can even hear the, if you're really quiet, the sound of the motors from the rotating. So what I did was I mapped the data from whatever the wave height was between a range of 0 and 180 degrees. So if the wave heights were larger, then the angle of rotation would be closer to 180. So basically, like I took 10 weeks of data from that period and kind of mapped it all and passed through. So at some stages of the day, you could hear like really like the motors were quite loud because that would have like kind of indicated larger swells or a storm perhaps. So unfortunately, people could only see it from outside the window because it was COVID. But that was kind of, I know I spent a lot of time talking about that, but it's kind of like a good insight to my very first project and where I kind of got my inspiration from and approached using data in my work. So I had the residency for two months. So I actually decided to completely transform the studio space, and it was on the main street so people could walk by. But because I always wanted the artwork to, I guess, like communicate a message or like engage the viewers, I really wanted to see how I could create something that people could interact with. But because no one was allowed into the space, I had the challenge of they having to like interact through windows. So there's like this small little camera down here that I attached to a Raspberry Pi, which is a small little computer that you can control. And then that also had sensors in the windows that if people moved their hand in front of it, or even if people walked by. Sometimes when large buses drove by as well, actually they like triggered visuals on the projector. So the movement of the people outside the space, it was a little bit temperamental depending on the lighting. Also actually at night it worked a lot better because there was less reflections on the window. So yeah, it was kind of it's called sea turtles, and that's spelled purposely because kind of communicate what turtles see underwater. And they end up eating the plastic bags, which gives them an unnatural buoyancy. So then they float closer to the top of the water, and then they actually end up getting struck by boats or other marine vessels. So that was that project. And then again, yeah, they posed different challenges because of the pandemic, and also just being in a different environment as well. And I had the computer vision element, the projections, and then the sensors that all had to kind of talk to each other. So it was quite a system that was had to be talking to each other. Then the next one, I still wanted to use data, but also kind of to do with the environment. So for this one, I used 13, you can't see, this one used 13 stepper motors. So a stepper motor is one that has a full rotation. So I attached nearly like 50 plastic bottles to these motors and installed it in a space in Goldsmiths. And then it also was accompanied by a soundscape that I recorded from actual plastic bottles underwater, and what they sounded like colliding beneath the water surface, to really kind of communicate to people, well, what does life underwater here when all of this trash, plastic, discarded material is disposed of in their environment. So this, I'm really not very skilled at doing like 3D mock-ups, so this is kind of like what I would do, being like, and I have the vision, but other people are like, what is that? But yeah, you can kind of see I had the projector, the plastic bottles, the shadows. I think shadows are also quite a good way of like kind of giving the illusion that the installation is bigger, because obviously like you can't always have a massive big space, but it kind of, and it like is cost effective as well. So this was, the data that I took was from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So a similar weather station to the one off the west coast of Ireland. So it's kind of like located in Hawaii. And this one I actually took nearly 10 years of data, and I actually, I just took the maximum, like kind of ranged the values from the minimum and the maximum, so it wouldn't have to loop through lots, and then it would kind of iterate through from like low to high. So it was a really immersive experience, as well as the sound that accompanied it. And then also the projections that I had to kind of further enhance the immersive experience. They kind of lerped, so it was like through creative coding. So instead of just projecting a block color, I kind of lerped it so that it would go from dark navies to kind of lighter, to kind of get that feeling as if you were in the depths of the water, and then like rising to the top and then back down. But again, you can kind of see the way the shadows kind of worked as well. And then I had like lots of, this was for the final show of the first year, so I took like all the other people that were on the course, I just told them all to bring in their bottles at the end of the day. So the way that there was like a larger range of motion with this one than the original project, because the motors were able to like kind of rotate the full way. So it really felt like you were kind of almost bobbing in the ocean. So then that was the end of the first year, and then I kind of was introduced, I got a little bit better at kind of like the conceptual framework of my work. And this is terminology, because I always struggle to articulate these terms when I'm talking without looking. And the previous project, Message in a Bottle, was kind of my first introduction to hyperobjects, which is a term used to describe global phenomenon which have enormous impact on our world, but can actually be really overwhelming to kind of like comprehend and relate to, like just how much they are present on Earth. or visible. So like examples of this is actually climate change, plastic, styrofoam, black holes, and tides. And then it's a term coined by Timothy Morton. And then another term that I was introduced to was hydrofeminism, which is like an emphasis on collectivity, but kind of like learning from water. So if we're all bodies of water, I would think we're each made up of like between 70% and 80% of water. We're all connected, and we're also connected to the watery planet in which we live. So we're like a fluid continuum. So we can all kind of learn from water and the attributes that it has to be more fluid and dynamic to the way we approach each other, the way we approach like non-humans and other beings on the planet. So this was the final project that I did at the end of my second year, and it was called 372.5 Howth. And you'll probably see that's very similar to the 372.5 River Thames down the back. So this was kind of like the start of this larger ongoing body of work that I've been exploring since then. And this was the space that I was showing it in Goldsmith, so it was really nice natural light. And a big part of my work is scaling iteratively, so if I have an idea, I'll start small, and then, well, I didn't really do that with the seasick project, but for this one I started small, and then, so this is kind of like the early stages, and again, it kind of looked quite like a mess, but if I had the vision, so I continued to push, and then this was the, again, so this is where like I would paddleboard when I go home. It's obviously such a gorgeous day back in Dublin, not cloudy at all. So this was me paddleboarding, and this actually is a large like marker that I could kind of tell as well if I was to stay paddleboarding and then stop paddling, you can really see the effect that the tides and the current have and like the force. So it's just like, it could be an invisible force unless it's really strong, you can see on the surface of the water, but to almost like feel that with no wind that you're moving. So this was installed, so this, the tidal range in Howth is about 4 meters, and luckily the church in Goldsmiths has really high ceilings, so I was able to get the accurate range in motion. So this was the original camshaft that I designed. So in contrast to the previous projects that I had worked on, they had all involved multiple physical computing components or multiple motors or sensors. But what I was so obsessed with the tides was that nature makes this look so effortless, this huge volume of water that is redistributed twice a day, every day, all over the world. So instead of using multiple motors to get that rich movement, I really wanted to boil it down to just one motor. And as I said, or someone I said to earlier, I'm not an engineer, but I was really determined. So I managed to get it down to 2 motors, one for that controlled the data. So that was like the vertical movement of the ebb and flow of the tides in Howth. And then I had another one that was like a sinusoidal camshaft that created the undulations along the fabric, because I didn't want it to just be a static piece moving up and down. That wouldn't have been like an accurate representation of the waters that we all know, or the surface of waters either. And then one day I had a brainwave of what would it look like if I combined those 2 mechanisms together. And that was when I designed the kind of like a sinusoidal camshaft that also hoisted and created the undulations along the fabric. I thought it was the bee's knees until I started developing it, and then I realized I had not understood what I had chewed off. So this mechanism was also ended up being like 120 centimeters long. So, and the discs that I was using were only 3 millimeters. So it was like a lot of discs that I had to laser cut. And again, because I'm not an engineer, I didn't realize that like if the motor at one end is going like rotating, why is it the same at the other end? But the technicians were like, that is not how physics works. So then suddenly, because I had scaled it to be 120 centimeters, I was like, well, you need supports at like 30 centimeters at each stage. And suddenly there was like hundreds of pieces involved in the installation. But I'm a devil for punishment, so I didn't give up. Sorry, where are we? And then I ended up showing a smaller version at the V&A for London Design Festival, and then I was accepted to do a residency over in America at the Tides Institute and Museum of Art, where they have the largest tides in the world. So in contrast to the tidal range in Howth, which is 4 meters, the tidal range that they would experience at the Bay of Fundy is 16 meters, so it's like 4 times the size. And I even, like, I had this plan that I was going to go there, and I was going to like create my own sensor that I could just throw in the water like in front of my studio and be able to send the data back to myself, and like it'll be so nice. And I wanted to paint the tides while I was there, so I wanted the sensor right in front of my studio to talk to me, and then like create like just the tangible, almost like a voice, but like on fabric or paper. And then I was like, gosh, that's like a really big, that's like 28 feet. So I don't know how like a sensor is going to like be able to like have that range. So I started going on all the different forums. And in the comments on those things, I don't know if anyone's on those forums, but like a lot of people are just like not that helpful, or like really doubt you. You're like, oh, you noob. Anyway, there was one person that there was like, there's no way that the tidal range is 28 feet. And I was like, well, and then before I could even reply, they had gone and deleted their comment because they obviously realized that they were wrong. But it was, so this is a smaller version that I brought over with me actually. That I had in the front of the studio. But actually, I think I'll just continue on that one and go back, sorry. Got my slides a bit. Sorry. So this is kind of where, just so you know where I am. Eastport is up here where I had the residency. And the reason that they have the largest tidal range in the world is because the shape of the bay. Kind of an easy way that I kind of understood it was, so the unusual shape of the bay means like the flush of the water goes in, creates such a drastic movement, and when it goes out, kind of, you know, feel like you're in the bath and you suddenly go like this or like this, because the bath is like quite an elongated shape. That's kind of the similar situation with this bay. And so this was an example of every day I used to go down with my sensor that I then had to realise that the Coast Guard would not let me just throw my own sensor in the sea. They weren't too keen on that one, so I had to get my own sensor. And I would go down and physically do the readings every morning or at the different times of the day. So this here is at 7:46 a.m. and that was when the tide was all the way out. And then back at high tide, which was at around 3, this is a fishing trawler, and that had risen all the way up. And you can see that like the whole shape of the bay completely changes. Like the visuals of the whole town would be completely different at different times of the day. So it was a really interesting period of time. They also called it a city, and when I got there, it was actually 1,300 people in the whole place. I was like, okay, I'm here for 4 weeks now. But it was amazing, and the people that I met there were so nice. Especially because I didn't know anybody and I was so far away from home. But even like some of the issues that I was having, like again, not being an engineer, like the local community were so keen to help out. So this was me taking the data, and then this was for some of the readings, like because the tide was so far out, the sensor that I had, the cable wasn't long enough, so I had to actually climb down this ladder. So this was one of the examples of the projects that I kind of developed there. So this, because I wasn't able to take the sensor readings from directly, what I did was I just created my own database with a spreadsheet and then communicated that to, like, this is an Arduino, and then the same motors that I had used for the message in a bottle. So it was able to rotate the full 360 degrees. So you can kind of see like almost what I was trying to do. So when the water was more shallow, it would like be denser color, and then like as you got the tide rose up, and then it would be like different visualizations throughout different days. Where are we now? So those are kind of some of the examples. And although I wasn't able to use or record my own data all the time, there are the NOAA stations that I used for the Message in a Bottle project. very conveniently, they had a the exact same station right outside the studio. So this is what one of those NOAA stations is or looks like. So this here is a sensor that they have. So this was at like sunrise, and that land there is actually Canada. So I was in America, but that land is Canada. And then they have other weather sensors up here as well. So that was great. I was able to download that and know that that was actually kind of where I was. So then they were kind of just work in progresses that I was developing there. This one was kind of like an exploration of, because people kind of live so much by the tides there, and because of the close proximity to Canada and where I was, the time zones on my phone would change. It was so strange. So actually, like sometimes I'd be like, wait, what is the real time? Am I in Canadian time or am I in American time? So I kind of like really started to play with the aspect of time. So for this piece, it was kind of like breaking time into the 3 tenses. So I looked at like within the notion of tide. So the one on the left was like the past recordings, and then the one on the right was the predicted, and then the ones in the middle were present, and that was kind of like the ones that I would have recorded by hand. And it was also kind of like when I was younger, I used to change the barometer with my dad like every week to see what the atmospheric pressures were like, just like kind of as a child that we used to do that weekly activity. So it was really felt like, gosh, reflecting on those periods that like, wow, is that like a subconscious thing that I had remembered while I was there? So that was an amazing experience. And then I've missed out on a project here. Earlier that year, I submitted a proposal to N.Y.Sea Open Data Week, and this, sorry, I can put the slideshow. This project here incorporated 2 different data sets. One was the storm flooding, and then the other was the rise in sea levels. So Manhattan is situated in the center of the Hudson River and the East River. And because of climate change, they are experiencing severe rainstorms that are having a really big impact on the subway system. So this piece used a very similar mechanism to 372.5, but instead I actually embroidered the N.Y.Sea subway system onto the fabric so that people, it was shown in New York, so people could actually kind of, it was something that they might actually be able to relate to easier, as opposed to the tides, because the rivers wouldn't have such a large tidal range. And yeah, so it kind of gave life to like this reality that the subway system is facing. And then ironically, late in 2024, the storms really did flood the subway systems, and it was all over the news. So yeah, this was like an adaptation of the mechanism. And then that brings us on to a project that I started working on in late December. And it was kind of an ongoing project though, that I had been always wanting to do. So I'm a really big sea swimmer, or cold water swimmer. So within like the year, just over like maybe 13 months, I ended up swimming like 115 times, and I had created my own database as well with the locations that I went, the times that I went, and the different tidal heights. So they're all different locations. And then I used a creative coding algorithm, as well as it's called like an easier way to calculate the tides. It's called the rule of 12ths. So the way 372.5 is like, that's how many minutes it takes for the tides to go from low tide to high tide. I kind of broke it down into a period of 12 hours. So there's 24 lines in each drawing. And the point of intersection is the tidal level and the time at which I went swimming at. So it was a very personal project that I wanted to do, and then I wanted it to be tangible as opposed to just completely online. So I ended up, I wanted to execute it on a pen plotter. So these are like various different locations. Most of them were in Dublin, but again, because I am when I go back home, I'm on a peninsula, so there's lots of different spots to go, and some are Some are more suitable at different, this is the data set, and then this is a very low tide day that I went out, Dollymount Beach, and the iconic chimneys there as well. So yeah, there was something about like, I guess like the persistent aspect of doing the same activity, but it also felt so different. And I thought it was really interesting, like even writing the code and creating the algorithm and seeing just how different all of the entries looked. And yet it's kind of not that different, but it's just like, I guess, the time that makes it different. And the locations depending on where they were. So these were all different ones that I did. And there's something about, I think, the curves as well, like they're called Bezier curves as well, that like looks quite like a female form as well, like that fluidity. And then what I wanted to do was go back to, before I went to Maine, I got invited to show with a project called the Eco Showboat in Dublin, and I got funding from the Irish Arts Council, and they wanted to exhibit my 372.5 piece. So I decided that this was my opportunity, now that I had a little bit of budget, to redesign it so that it was more sustainable, or what I really wanted to do as well was to design it in such a way that it was modular, so I could actually adapt it to different locations. Also different like settings, like not everywhere has like ceilings that are 9 meters high. Just to make it like, that I could redesign it as well, that put it on it like 2 planes instead, so there was like multiple kind of like movements along the fabric. So I completely redesigned it, and it's actually similar to the one that is back there. So also in terms of like sustainability, if I was to like never be showing it again, I didn't want just these lumps of acrylic to go to waste or plastic to go to waste. So there is nearly 2,000 pieces in this one that I'll show you the video of, and this one back here, the River Thames. So the sinusoidal mechanism, and then the top frame, throughout all of it, only 9 are glued. So it could be taken apart, or that like each module could be dismantled, or even like you could have one with the 3 threads. I don't know if everyone's had a chance to go and look at it yet, but like kind of the way the weights are distributed along the fabric, you could almost have like an individual piece of fabric, another one, showing the data from different locations. So this is the River Liffey, and it actually divides Dublin City in 2, and it's where the water meets the Irish Sea. So the tidal range here is similar to Howth, so it's about like 3 or 4 meters depending on like the time of year, or like the lunar cycle. So this one was really exciting. Their ceilings were 14 meters high, so I scaled it up a little bit because I was like, okay, well, this is my opportunity as well. So, I completely rebuilt everything, and my brother's based in Dublin, so it was actually great. I got him to go up the cherry picker and like an actual engineer to sort out the top part of it. And then, I built redesigned the files on in the acrylic, and then reprinted all the little loops. So it was just more, it was just like kind of more condensed, and less things could happen to it. But when I designed it in Goldsmiths, again, like the whole physical or physics side of things, I was like, no, there's no way that anything could like shift. And it's like, no, things tweak and loosen and everything. So it's been a really big learning curve. And then, so that's kind of talking about the River Thames as well. So that project there was, and then this one here is kind of to do with the prints in the back. So again, kind of like similar to the syntax of a swimmer that I had created at the end of last year with all the data. For these prints here for InScope, I wanted to create something that was more focused on like London data as well, more site specific, but also in keeping with like the macro systems that are at play with the environment. and how we can then like almost like visualize them in, again, like a tangible way. So this was, again, kind of about like sourcing the data and figuring out like, well, is it open source, or how do I get it, or if I want to download it, what format is it in? So this is the Port Authority, and how you can kind of just find all of these boxes are actually title readings that you can find and click into, and then you'll be able to like see different readings throughout the time, and then they also were broken down. This is another way that you could look at it, but again, it's easier to get it in a CSV file or like a spreadsheet and then play around with it. And then it also like kind of broke it down into the lunar cycle as well, which was really nice. So then I could figure out like what like the ranges were throughout the different lunar cycles throughout the year. So this is kind of just like a little bit of like behind the scenes. I don't know if everybody likes spreadsheets here, but I love them. So that's kind of like a fun part, I guess, if you're able to find the data. And this is where I'm based in Somerset House. It's great because you can kind of look at the tides and then cycle along them. And then this is, for this one and the syntax of a swimmer, I used a really user-friendly platform online called P5JS. And then I export the files as a CSV format and then plot them with a drawing machine. And then what I'm currently working on, so at the moment I'm based in Somerset House and I'm focusing on the issue of flooding in the UK. And it's kind of, I've been chatting to quite a number of people from like different industries about it, and it's really not communicated or spoken about that much in the UK, and it's actually not even like the actual water aspect of the issue. It's more the other things that are like less seen. So it is another example of a hyperobject because of like the vastness of the issue. So not just the water, but then like the communities that it's impacting, like people's homes, if they're at risk of flooding. First of all, they're not insured, and then second of all, no one's going to buy them, so they're kind of stuck. And if they are able to sell them, then they're disrupting like their whole, or like they're leaving their community, their support network. So it's a really delicate problem that I'm trying to find out ways to kind of, I guess, communicate in a similar way to the other projects that I've worked on, kind of like invite people into the conversation in a way that is not really bleak, and kind of like bring them in with like a positive way that like, well, actually, how can we talk about this and how can we respond to the problem proactively? So this actual screenshot here, the flood warnings, that was from like literally 3 hours ago. So 2 flood warnings and then 23 flood alerts, and I didn't even think it was raining that much today, but that's how much the city has been developed on like marshlands and everything. So it might not appear to be like really badly flooding, but like literally like from one side of the road to the other, it could actually like change the whole situation. And then this here is just a little photograph. In November, I had a residency with an artist called Petra Ivanova, and she's based in Berlin, and it was in a program called Studio Quantum. So it was looking at quantum computing, quantum technology, and how we can kind of reassess the vast topic of quantum. And we both were looking at it from a more like hydrofeminism lens. So the way most people have been brought up in education is thinking like the classical theory, and that's like yes, no, stop, go, like left, right. So that's how we all like have been taught to live, but in reality, that's really, it doesn't work like that. Everything is grey, everything's between the lines. And sorry, I don't mean grey as in depressing, it's like more, it's just like blurred. So we were kind of thinking, wow, like quantum theory invites us in to think similarly, in similar ways to hydrofeminism, how things can be more fluid. Like person A can be right, person B can also be right at the same time. And it's a bit more of a Venn diagram situation as opposed to like one person being in the right, one person being in the wrong. So it was kind of an interesting dialogue that we had for the few weeks of the residency. So we're still working on that, even though we're not in the same place. And then, yeah, I think that's kind of like a very brief summary of the last 4.5 years, but I hope you found it interesting. And if anybody has any questions or wants to go back to any of the projects, let me know. Or otherwise, you can save questions with a beer or anything like that. But yeah. And thank you so much all for coming, especially on this rainy evening. So I really appreciate it. Thanks. Yes?
Maybe I missed it, but when the data isn't open source, how exactly do you get it? Like you talked about creating your own sensor, which you weren't allowed to do. But I don't know what that looks like or how you go about creating that.
So that's a massive challenge. So it kind of depends on like the duration of the project, or I guess if I'm collaborating with somebody. Again, yeah, it was probably very naive of me to think that like, oh, I'll just rock over to America and throw this sensor in the water and it'll all be happy days, especially when I was only there for 4 weeks. So that's probably a flaw of mine, that I'm like very ambitious, and then like the reality is like, no, Kerrie, you do not have that many resources at hand. You're there by yourself. So in terms of that, I think researching the data is always so important, like from the outset, especially if you have an idea and you're like, oh, I want to visualize this data set or like this abstract information like that I want to use. Finding out if that data is already available or if you have to pay for it. So some of the projects that I've worked on are also like using API keys. So that is like where someone else has stored the data online and then you can call it down from the internet, kind of like scraping information. But again, it's like you're allowed to do it, but you might have to pay per call. So if you like call it the information to pull down and like save to your computer or whatever device you're using, say every minute while you're running the program, suddenly you'd have like a massive bill and you're like, oh, whoops. So it might be a way of like doing that like one day and downloading all the information for like a large time range instead of having it. And a lot of people also ask me, are the projects running in real time? And although that sounds like really nice and idyllic, most of the environmental data that I've worked with, or just in general, doesn't actually change that much from 1 minute to the next. It's like temperature. If you like go outside now and like measure what like the temperature is, and I say, okay, go out and do it again in 5 minutes, like that's actually not going to change. So especially for like the kind of the storytelling aspect of my work, I kind of want to give like a larger time lapse of the issues like that climate change is like presenting us, instead of like, oh wow, like, well, yeah, it is real time, but especially like for this piece here, no one is going to wait 372 minutes for the piece to go from low to high and back. So yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's definitely something that like I need to start doing like at the initial stages of the project to see. Also, you might think like this data is like going to be really interesting, and then you're like, oh wow, actually that's not really the story that I thought I was going to communicate. So then maybe it might be not the data that you actually thought it was, and maybe it's different forces at play. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Firstly, thank you for an extraordinary body of work.
Oh, thank you.
Over a short amount of time as well. It's amazing.
Thanks.
I'm just wondering, like, I mean, how is your work viewed or communicated within the scientific community? How do they view your place within that, or what place, or?
I think I've had some really interesting conversations with scientists in Ireland, because there's actually like on the West Coast again, there's a huge centre for like Marine Institute and people that are like monitoring like different variables of the weather, especially with all the different stations that are located off the West Coast. I think probably there's some issues in terms of that, like I would use artistic license to maybe like, especially say with the ceiling heights being like 14 meters, like I want to exaggerate the movement instead of it being like precisely like, oh this, and as well as like speeding up the movement. So I think like there's different ways. I would love to work with more scientists, especially to communicate the behavior from life below water as well. So it's kind of tricky to have like be in the room with the scientists as well. Yeah.
So there's that poetic aspect within your work as well, which is what
So sorry,
the
which?
poetic aspect, which is
Yeah.
which is the communication part.
Exactly, yeah.
That was the other part of that question. Was so now you've like actually answered that without me asking.
Yeah.
Is that exists?
Yeah.
Do you feel as though that rubs the scientific community up?
I'm not too sure. I think, like ultimately, if they're doing all the research, I'm sure they wouldn't have a problem with me trying to like invite more people or attracting more people into the conversation. So yeah, I would hope not. I'm not, but it's also like, I mean, we want to communicate the same thing, and it's about like engaging more people, and like as a community of like different industries as well, like collectively understanding the different issues you're facing, like from various industries or various like aspects, and then trying to like collectively again work out how to like behave as a whole in responding to it. Does that answer? Yeah? Okay, cool.
Yeah, when I see your work, it kind of, obviously initially you feel like you're looking at the surface of the sea rippling.
Yeah.
Occasionally it feels like sandy desert maybe. But it could easily also be like, I don't know, like a rib cage almost breathing, and it feels quite figurative in times.
I think also, in some ways, I think that's like maybe subconsciously a bit of like the hydrofeminism, like very like human form or human shapes that kind of also like are woven in maybe, like even
taught to find those features.
Exactly, yeah. Even like sometimes if people want to do this, they're more than welcome. If you like almost like lie underneath the installation or like kind of look from it does actually almost look like somebody's breathing.
Does it feel like that to you when you're working on it? It's almost like one of the shots in there you were revealing, I think it was the blue fabric on it, and it looked kind of like in like a film when they'll reveal like a dragon in a cave.
Yeah.
They'll have like the bones and the flesh, like, but you can't see anything else.
Yeah.
You see this kind of abstract shot. But
I think like for me, for me, like the ocean almost is like Earth's pulse, like how much it moves and like everything that the sea and the ocean does for us. Like it provides so much to the entire population of Earth, and yet we're still there, melting ice caps and everything like that. So there is that element, I think, that like Mother Nature has to breathe, and trying to communicate that in a way that it's like, I guess, for people to feel more empathy towards it and I guess like resonate like emotionally, is kind of one of the key things that, as part of the whole story that I'm trying to tell with whatever data set it could be or wherever the piece is shown, like that would be something that I'm trying to achieve.
But you still visualise that your work is always going to be attached to the movement of water. Would it have like a kind of movement that would resemble, like at the moment it's almost so attached to water that the movements are kind of generally like quite smooth, aren't they? And it has that kind of rhythmic.
Yeah. We can chat. We can extend the conversation if you like after. Yeah. Yep.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wondered, when did you first think of using data, and that approach to your art?
I think probably when I was doing my undergraduate degree, which was very, so it was management science and information systems. So the information systems aspect kind of did look a lot at data, and I can't actually remember when I graduated, but it was like 12 years ago. So it was kind of when like big data was like really big. And it was like, wow, there's this much data that's existing and being collected. Now we're kind of realizing that as like a whole like community, whereas back then it was kind of, well, that's what we were being taught. So there was people that were like specialized in that, and that's what we were being like had signed up to study. So I think that was kind of, I was like, wow, the information that I was working with, or we were working at as students back then, I probably wasn't that interested in. Like we were designing cheese databases and stuff like that, or like car databases. Whereas I guess maybe like in the back of my mind, I was like, wow, like the potential to do with something with other types of data that could be far more interesting or like engaging with other people. And I always kind of thought like even like in terms of songs, like how could they be visualized, like taking like the sound pitches or like the data from the noise and then visualized in different ways, or colors and stuff like that. Yeah, and I think I've always liked numbers. I've always liked maths and spreadsheets, and like the like functions and everything like that, the problem solving aspect. And I think part of me probably always wanted to like find ways to make it more attractive to other people who probably like hated spreadsheets, or weren't really into it, to be like, oh wow, like actually there's cooler aspects or cooler like applications that can be done with this type of work. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you for your talk. A few times this evening, the questions you mentioned like the stories that you want to tell.
Yeah.
So looking back in this like 4 or 5 years of production of your body of work, and try to summarize in a few words, but what is the story that you're trying to tell?
I guess trying to tell the story of how much data is out there, and actually how much data is being collected about Earth, nature, environmental systems, and how can we understand the systems better, and look like retrospectively at the data to see what has changed over those prolonged periods of time, and how can we then respond to those changes. If we can pinpoint like, well, that's changing, why is it changing? I guess that's kind of back to like the scientists would then be looking at the data, and then it's to try and like look at ways. So say like with sea turtles, to try and look at like, well, why are like a lot of these sea turtles dying? And then obviously like when the scientists go and like do a post-mortem on them and they find all the plastic like that they've ingested, that's kind of like how they obviously understood that they was causing the unnatural buoyancy in them. So I guess kind of finding like different ways to look at something that is obviously not very like, it's heartbreaking, but like trying to get people into the conversation to be like, wow, actually, and then that's when you have like a knock-on effect. And then also I think even though like the 372.5 doesn't explicitly talk about the rising sea levels, I think when you kind of understand the force of nature, that that volume of water is redistributed twice a day, every day, all over the world, you're kind of like, wow, like with the rising sea levels that then get added on to these tides, like at different locations, like what would that then look like? And it's kind of like the stories, yeah, to like not explicitly prompt, because I don't want to tell somebody this is what you should do, but I think maybe for them to like step back and like even like ponder on like later that day, or if it's in a few weeks later, they're like, oh wow, like maybe that was what that was. And I think as well, especially the 372.5 body of work, and the message in a bottle, like they're all systems in terms of like I get the data from somewhere, the data's fed into something. If I took apart one of those pieces, like in the mechanism or like the way the frame is, like it would have a knock-on effect to the entire installation or the entire piece. And I think that is like when you look at like the microsystems within our environment, if you like take out one piece or one piece is affected by X, like that does have a knock-on effect to the like the macro system. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, the stories are kind of like more like as a whole, as opposed to this is like the exact story I'm telling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. And
No problem.
I really like the project that you had, the sheet that floats up and then it moves with the motors, right? Yeah, so the motor is the output and then the input is the data.
Yeah.
My main question is like, what medium did you communicate the data through? Like medium or input? Like, because that was Arduino, right? Arduino.
Yes.
With the motor running.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of medium did you put the data through?
Oh, so for the different projects, it's kind of different. Do you mean in like what code format, or like spreadsheet, or?
Like, because with the big number of data, like obviously, I don't know. Yeah.
So it depends whether I am able to download it as like a CSV file or if it's a JSON file. So it might be like looping through an array.
Okay.
Is that the question you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Looping through an array for like the different values. So that might be for, say, for the wave heights one for the individual pieces of fabric, that loop through each wave height. And that was like, okay, at this wave, tell motor A to go like this, B. And then when it was boil down to just one motor, then it's kind of more of a series of loops, and you're kind of looking for the ranges, like calculating the min, the max, and then incorporating the time element as well. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah.
For your pen drawings,
Yeah.
based on the tidal data from the Thames,
Yeah.
I was curious how you got from the tidal data from the Thames to the generation of the different shapes of the pen drawings.
Oh, these ones over here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I actually had written down to say that. So that is using, so for the syntax of a swimmer body of work, that was kind of like using the data in conjunction with the Bezier curves equation. And then for these ones, because it's called horology and hydrology, I kind of wanted to incorporate circles into like the piece as well, because like the notion of time and circles and infinity. So I used an equation called the Fourier transfer series. So the inputs were the times, the tides, and the lunar cycles, and then they affect the lines and the circles that are drawn. So as the sine wave almost of like the highs and lows of the tides through the whole of 2024. Sorry, I'm not sure if you saw the pieces there, but they're the pen plots. And based on like the readings of the tides at each lunar cycle, then that affects like the length of the line, the size of the circle, and that's then what generates the shapes at the top. Yeah?
Amazing, yeah, thanks.
No problem. Yeah.
Hey, Kerrie.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about this crazy artistic ambition that you have.
Okay.
Because
Which one?
this really taken with that story that you've done a degree in management information systems, you've worked a little bit in an art gallery, but you decided to do an MFA, and your first project, you're like, I'm going to create an artwork with 36 meters, loads of bits of fabric, and then we're going to take over a gallery, we're going to turn it interactive with motion sensors.
Yeah.
And it's just that, where does that drive for that creative ambition come from? Because I'm not a creative person with brains in my
Yeah.
how you'd even begin to start going down that journey. And what was that like?
Gosh, that's a loaded question. I don't know. I think I have always been really creative. Like literally, like in the airport, on planes, going out for dinner. Like as like a young child, like any chance I was probably sketching. Like they weren't very good or anything, but I was always like a little bit of a perfectionist in terms of like staying in the lines. Like so, like my brother would be like, and I'd be like meticulous and like just the differences. But I think I've always just and like it wouldn't even necessarily always be for other people. They might just be drawings for myself, or I think I was really lucky when I was in school. I had two really good art teachers. One school, she was from End, and then I moved school, and the art teacher from that school ended up coming with me as well, and I'm still in contact with both of them, which is really nice. And then part of me also wonders, like maybe I should have gone to art college straight after school, but I don't think that we can look back like that. And also I wouldn't have any idea how to code properly had I not done that. So when I was very young, my parents brought me and my brother to Australia, and I collected shells. So I think I was 5, and they were kind of like not the barnacles, but the other ones that like don't have the holes. And my parents' friends were artists and framers, and we went down to their house to like frame the shells after. And I think she was really taken aback the way I like positioned them, like off-centered, but like it wasn't like a 5-year-old probably would have structured shells in a frame. And I think I actually remember her reacting, being like, "Oh, this is quite like purposely positioned here, like and intendedly placed, as opposed to just throwing them in there." And I think, that always stuck with me. Yeah. Is that it? Yeah? Yeah.
Could you tell me much more about how did you apply hydrofeminism to your work?
I think kind of touching on the question with James was, I guess because of all the work is to do with like fluid and like the movement and the currents of water, I guess in terms of definitely the tides, like that body of water is moving. So there's no barrier, and it's like tide, it just moves back into low tide, and then there's no barriers or like restraints. So that is kind of what like hydrofeminism, a term a philosopher Astrida Nemilis, she talks about how we can learn from the fluidity of water and the dynamic aspect it has. That like, so if we kind of lived a bit more fluidly or more dynamic, we'd be more open to other people's opinions, we'd be more open or like more empathetic to other people's ways of living, instead of like putting up our barriers and not letting people in, or not having like patience with people who might have different views or beliefs. So it's kind of like, yeah, having a little bit more empathy with one another to kind of understand that everyone's kind of coming from different areas, but how can we take a step back and kind of understand and work on working together? Is that, I can give you some more details if she's done some really good podcasts and books that kind of explain it better instead of just my one sentence. Yeah? Yeah?
What did you say the name was? Sorry.
Astrida Nemilis. Yeah. I can send it to you. Or, yeah. Okay, cool. So there's...